53 Bell Court. The wheels of the push-bike were a blur in the early evening twilight. The boy was pedalling furiously, conscious of the fact that the battery in his front light was dead, and soon the street lights would be flickering into life. He had to finish the paper round before darkness set in, or his dad would kill him for going out with dodgy lights. The rear one bracketed beneath his seat was fine. It glowed bright red, and could be seen easily by cars. The front one, though, was deader than he would be in 30 minutes if he did not get a move on. With a fresh push, he bumped up onto the footpath and cut across damp grass, leaving a furrowed parting in his wake. His eyes darted left and right, making sure they had not been seen. The last thing he needed right now was some old biddy taken into task for being a young hooligan with no regard for his elders. All he wanted to do was get the final 3 papers delivered and just get home. With a screech of brakes and an awesome sideways skid, he brought the bike to a rest at the corner of a complex of small block of flats, though his next location, Bell Court. He hopped off and pushed the bike through the middle of the quad. Flowers grew in neat rectangular beds. Some sort of fancy tree stood off to one side, under which a cat dozed lazily. A scene of peaceful tranquillity. The boy shuddered and felt sick inside. He rested his bike against a full-length glass window next to the door of one of the blocks of flats. 50 to 60 Bell Court announced the sign stuck to the glass. The boy took a deep breath, which was immediately followed by a sigh of the damned. He placed his hand on the door handle, turned, and pushed. The intense smell of flowers wafted over him. He wriggled his nose, which was fighting against the overwhelming fragrance of lavender and rose that made up the astringent air freshness someone had been spraying around down here. His trainers squeaked against the highly polished floor, and he wondered how it was that the old people didn't slip over and break a hip or something. That was what old people did, wasn't it? They were feeble and frail, which is why they ended up in places like this, all penned together to keep them safe from harm. Well, that's what his mum said. She told him that being old was a terrible thing. Your body started to shrivel and die once you hit 60. Bits started to stop working properly, and sometimes things even fell off. His gran had ended up in an old folks' home. They'd gone to visit just the once. Never again. It'd been awful. The smell of wee, the muttering and ramblings of old crazy people. Oh, sloppy food that dribbled just down their chins. No. The boy grimaced. No. He did not want to get old. Didn't know how, but he was going to cheat the aging process. Somehow he was going to stay young and fit just as he was now. Perhaps he could meet a vampire. A good one, mind, not an evil one. He could get the good vampire to turn him and keep him young. That'd be cool. Okay, so he couldn't go out in the daytime, but surely living forever would be worth it. Sometimes you just had to make a sacrifice. When people wanted to be doctors, they studied really hard and did not play on computer games, which are a well-known distraction. Well, avoiding sunlight would be like that. It would be his sacrifice for living forever. The boy gave a quick glance over his shoulder to make sure that his bike hadn't slipped down the glass window. It had done that once before and the handlebars had twisted. That had been a pain to fix. It was still propped up, so he walked over to the foot of the staircase that led up to the upper level. It was dark up there. It was always dark up there. The boy pushed the light switch. It was one of those timer ones that popped back after about 5 minutes and the light went out to save electricity. The light at the top of the stairs flickered into life. 5 minutes. That was all he had. Easy. Run up the stairs, get the paper out of the bag, shove it in the flap, and run like hell. His feet were frozen at the foot of the stairs, and the seconds ticked by. The boy chewed at his bottom lip. This was silly, really silly. He reached into his bright yellow delivery bag and fished out a copy of the Chronicle. He folded it in 4 and tapped it against his left hand like a man weighing the chances he had of crossing a road at speeding traffic. He glanced at the light switch. It was already starting to push back out. He was wasting time here. He had to deliver this paper, then 2 more before legging it back home before dark. Slowly, he made his way up the staircase, willing his legs to move, refusing to let them turn and run back down to the safety of the ground floor. With each step, his resolve was put under greater pressure. With each footfall, his knees trembled and his bladder ached until finally he stood at the top of the stairs. He took a deep breath to steady himself and instantly gagged. Whereas the downstairs had smelt of chemically induced sprays of flowers, upstairs just smelt wrong. There was a dark mustiness in the air, combined with a pervasive odour that normally accompanied something having been left in the fridge for far too long. He slapped his mouth shut, held his breath, and pressed on along the corridor. His destination was down the far end, number 53. The light yellow door faced him, its glass panels staring out at him of the gloom. The light bulb was still out down there. It had been as long as he had been delivered papers on this round. Weren't they supposed to get fixed by a caretaker or someone? Surely the people living here must pay someone to do stuff like that. Yet it never got fixed. Perhaps the caretaker didn't come up here. Perhaps the caretaker knew what was living in number 53. A monster. The boy swallowed as the word stomped into his thoughts. A monster lived there, behind the door that would have once been a bright yellow, but was now a dull, fading shade of cream. It was as if the door itself had given up the ghost and died, just like those plants. He looked at them, the dried, shriveled up pot plants that sat next to the dead door. Like the faulty light, they too had never been tended to. They had just been left discarded. The boy realised that his lungs were burning. He snatched a quick breath and grimaced at the fetid stench. It was even worse here as he got closer to the door. What was causing it? The monster. That was what. A creature lived in that flat that was so vile it had to cower in the dark away from prying eyes. It created an evil lair where it pondered upon evil machinations. The boy had no idea what machinations were, but knew that's what monsters pondered on. Whatever pondering was. He was just a couple of footsteps away from the door now. The chronicle grasped in his left hand like a trusty sword, albeit that trusty swords did not tremble quite so much. His eyes were fixed on the tattered net curtains that draped down behind the smudged glass windows of the door. They were brown and ragged. They didn't have the look of material that had been ripped apart. Instead, they looked as if they were simply falling apart, rotting where they hung. He edged closer, his eyes never leaving them. With every centimetre of approach, and every move of every muscle, he expected them to swish back, and the monster to slam its ugly face against the window. There'd be fangs, and teeth, and fangs, and more teeth. It would gnash and snarl at him as its slimy drool splattered against the grimy glass, and his claws would scrape against the door in this dark recess of the corridor. Closer still he edged, closer and closer, his heart thrashing against his rib cage, and his lungs screaming at his mouth to send them some air. Eventually he reached about 50 centimetres from the door and bent over to tease the letter flap with his fingers. Slowly he lifted the flap, carefully checking to make sure nothing was peering out, no eyes, no antennae, no tentacles. When he was sure that the coast was clear, he presented the newspaper to the slot and tapped it in. He didn't hear the thud of it falling to the floor on the other side, as the sound of his running feet were making far too much noise, whilst conveying him out of the darkness and into the cool light of reality, the humdrum and the everyday. As the boy fled down the corridor, the decaying curtain twitched. A deformed hand, withered with incredible age, pulled the fraying material back, and a haggard face loomed out of the murk. The pallid skin contrasted with the red-rimmed eyes filled with hunger. This time, as many times before, it had been too slow. The aging process was catching up with it. It needed to feed soon to maintain its longevity, or it would waste away into old age and nothingness. That could not be allowed. It would be young again, with fresh blood coursing through its veins. Then it would move on once more, away from this dark little recess of a pathetic world, where people just regarded its kind as bogeymen, stories with which to scare their children. It would feed soon. Perhaps tomorrow, when the newspaper came. It would be waiting. Hungrily.